I'm Kaitlin Gallucci, and I'm the Communications Manager at Historic Huguenot Street, which is a nonprofit 10-acre National Historic Landmark District dedicated to preserving historic buildings, artifacts, and manuscripts, and promoting the stories of the Huguenot Street families who founded New Paltz. Tonight, we'll be discussing a program taking place on Huguenot Street this weekend with an organization called the Slave Dwelling Project. Historic Huguenot Street and the Department of Black Studies here at SUNY New Paltz are hosting an overnight visit by Joseph McGill, the founder of the Slave Dwelling Project. Founded in 2010, the nonprofit organization's mission is to identify and assist property owners, government agencies, and organizations in preserving our country's surviving slave dwellings. Joseph McGill travels the country, spending the night in historic slave dwellings to bring awareness to their existence, history, and need for preservation. Tomorrow night, he and his colleague Terry James will be spending the night in 2 cellar kitchens identified as former slave dwellings on Huguenot Street. Over the past 6 years, Joseph has slept overnight in more than 70 slave dwellings all over the country, but this will be just his second overnight in a New York State slave dwelling and his first visit to the Hudson Valley. His colleague Terry has slept in over 40 slave dwellings. Tonight, we are very lucky to have both Joseph and Terry in the studio. Thank you both so much for joining us.
You're welcome, Kaitlin.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you. So first of all, Joe, can you tell us a bit about your background and how it led you to develop the Slave Dwelling Project?
Yes, Kaitlin, you do that so well.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, this background that got me into this, I graduated from South Carolina State University, but before I graduated from South Carolina State University, my sophomore year there, I was employed during the summer at Fort Sumter National Monument. I was a park ranger for the National Park Service. I left there and went to a site on St. Helena Island, Penn Center. Penn Center, during the Civil War, became Penn School. It was a school for recently freed enslaved people. I was director of history and culture there. I left there and went to Iowa to oversee the building of an African American museum in the state of Iowa. Left there and I became employed by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the regional office in Charleston, South Carolina. While employed there and also being a Civil War reenactor, I kind of combined my desire for preservation and living history into this thing called the Slave Dwelling Project. My original intent was to, within 1 year, have this thing completed by just requesting from the stewards of slave dwelling for the opportunity to spend the night in these places, simply to bring attention to them, because there was something missing, a void in preservation. The buildings that we choose to preserve are usually those iconic, architecturally significant buildings. Those usually omit those places where the enslaved once stayed. So noticing this void, I created this thing called the Slave Dwelling Project. And 6 years later, over 100 days later, by the way, your
really?
information says 70.
Wow.
But it's been 100 plus sites in 17 different states and the District of Columbia. We're still at it.
Wow. That's wonderful. Yeah, no, we're so excited to have you spend the night on Huguenot Street as well. So can you tell me a bit about what inspired you to get involved, Terry?
Well, what inspired me was Joe and I both were Civil War reenactors. Mm-hmm. And when he first started out, asking the guys in our unit to join him overnight, so I thought Joe had lost his mind. But anyway, I decided to start staying with him. But my history is that my great-great-great-grandfather, 5 years out of slavery, purchased land in South Carolina, in Florence, South Carolina, well, Marion County at the time, back in 1870. And then 20 years later, 5 sons and son-in-law bought additional properties. Altogether, it's 246 acres, and we still have it in our family 146 years later.
Wow.
And so with that, My first day was in Anderson, South Carolina, and it was a property of the Palmetto Trust for Historic Preservation with Michael Beatenbach. And so they was talking about demolition, and so he's trying to find some buyers for the property. And so, because in the city limits of Anderson, South Carolina. So, but anyway, that was our first day, and the first cabin we went in, it was packed full of stuff, usually for a warehouse or something.
Oh, sure.
And so it was packed full of things. And so the second one went in, it was mildew, moisture. So we kind of decided that night we would stay in that particular one. But then my second stay was in Brattonsville in York County in South Carolina. Excuse me. And with that, I decided to start sleeping in shackles. I'll shackle my hands as a commemorative to my ancestors who were brought through the Middle Passage. Mm-hmm. And even though I didn't have the stench, the heat, and the physical conditions, I wanted to try to do that for them as a memorial to them surviving the journey. And so from there, I've slept in over 40 with my wrists shackled.
Wow.
And it's never comfortable, and every experience is different. You think about those who came across stacked on top of one another, and so you think about the heat. There's no air, proper air, and the smell. It was just awful. So I just imagine in my mind, how did they make it? So I kind of do that for them to bring some attention to the conditions that they had to travel here under.
And you'll be doing that tomorrow night as well?
Yes, I'll be doing that tomorrow night as well. I did it last night in Maryland, at the Annapolis, Maryland, at the James Bryce House.
Oh, okay.
And so I did it last night, and I'll be doing it again tomorrow night as well.
Wow. So one thing I want to mention, so last year, Joe, you spent your first overnight in New York State, specifically at the Sylvester Manor, the Joseph Lloyd Manor, and the Thomas Halsey Homestead, all on Long Island. Were you at that as well? No, that was just Joe?
Carolina.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, do you notice anything different about your overnights in northern states compared to your experiences at historic slave dwellings in the South?
Yeah. What I notice about the northern stays is once I forecast where I'm going or coming to, I get the most pushback when I talk about slavery in northern states, as if it didn't exist. There are those who take pride in the fact that there were Underground Railroad sites. It was the Northern Army who, during the Civil War, went down south and rid this nation of that institution of slavery. But I have to take them back a little further in their history than that. I have to remind them that once upon a time, their states too engaged in that institution of slavery. Of course, New York, 1799, slavery was abolished. But if you were not a certain age at that particular time, then you were not free. The last person freed in this state was 1827. And what I also notice about the northern states is the slavery was much more intimate, in the sense that they usually lived in the same buildings, either the basement or the attic. So there are those distinct differences that I've noticed about what I experience here in the North.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and going a little bit off of what you just said, the slave dwellings on Huguenot Street that Joe and Terry will be staying in are just as you said, they are cellars. They're a part of what was the slave owner's home. They have independent entrances, but they are still, part of the same structure. They're not separate cabins. They're not separate buildings. They're part of that same house. Have there been any reactions to this project, or any experiences over the years that have been particularly memorable or meaningful to you?
Well, certainly to me, of course, being the brainchild of this project, and right out of the blocks there was a lot of interesting comments. And I think the most memorable one was, if you want to get in contact with your ancestors, why don't you go to the ape section at the zoo? Any lesser person would have, would have retreated. Would have just thrown in the towel at that time. But I knew that what I was about to embark on was not an easy subject matter. If it was easy, someone would have done it by now. So there was that pushback. But I think the most memorable time for me, besides sleeping in some of these places with Terry James and others, and Terry James, while he sleeps, he rolls around, and you can hear those shackles on his wrist. But I think the most memorable time for me was in Brenham, Texas, when I stood on an auction block, an authentic auction block, and thought about those enslaved people who stood on auction blocks, those families being torn apart as a part of a family member being auctioned, or these enslaved people having to stand on auction blocks, having to bare their backs because they need to show that potential buyer that there weren't any marks on their backs. That potential buyer would not want to buy an enslaved person with those marks, because that's the sign of a defiant enslaved person. And why buy that person to insert amongst your already docile and broken enslaved people? Now, I also recall that one night at the very beginning at Boone Hall Plantation, when I slept in the cabin, waking up to the sounds of dogs barking in the background, and thinking at that very moment the possibility of enslaved people trying to escape and being chased by dogs.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. We're going to take a break soon, and I just want to share with our listeners a little bit more about the former slave dwellings in New Paltz. So both of these cellars have been a part of Historic Huguenot Street's regular tours for the past few years. This year, just one is featured on the tour, and that's one of the cellars that Joe and Terry will be staying in. And when guests enter the cellar, they learn about the enslaved experience in the region. Our interpretation of that experience is heavily influenced by the narrative of Sojourner Truth, who was a local slave, later a freed slave, and abolitionist in Ulster County. Right now, we're going to take a quick break, but we'll continue this discussion in a moment. You're listening to WFNP The Edge. Hi, and welcome back. You're listening to Historic Huguenot Street's weekly program on WFNP The Edge. I'm Kaitlin Gallucci, and I'm joined tonight by Joseph McGill and Terry James of the Slave Dwelling Project to discuss their visit to Huguenot Street this weekend. So, Joe, what if you could define it? What would you want guests to take away from your overnight in New Paltz on Huguenot Street?
Well, New Paltz, I want guests to take away the fact that slavery was not just a Southern thing. Although in 1861, when the Civil War started, there were 15 slaveholding states, and those states were Southern states and the District of Columbia. But they need to embrace the fact that in their history, if they go back far enough, that institution was very much a part of the founding of this nation, the founding of this state, and the people who were enslaved mattered. And no, the slavery that existed in these northern states was not any better than the slavery that existed in those southern states. These people were still enslaved. These people were a system of chattel slavery. Not only were they enslaved, but their children and their children's children will be enslaved. Our founding fathers set this nation on a path that would actually lead us or set us up for the shortcomings that we have today. That institution left a legacy on this nation that we're still dealing with today, and folks should should go away with that understanding. I certainly don't want them to go away with the impression that slavery was a good thing. I think that
Right.
if anybody walks away from any tour on that subject matter thinking that slavery was a good thing, then someone has failed in their attempt to interpret that subject matter.
Yeah, and I want to expand a bit on something you just said about how this institution has influenced the way things still are today. There was something we were talking about earlier before we got on the air, in terms of, so one example is here on this campus at SUNY New Paltz. There has been some discussion about the names of some of the dormitories and the name of the dining hall. They're named after some of the founders of New Paltz. However, as we know today, these founders of New Paltz were also slave owners. And you were saying something very interesting earlier about how you feel about in terms of with something like this, do we change the names? Do we leave the names as they are? I'm just wondering if you can share a little bit about how you feel about that.
I can share a lot, but I don't think I have time
We have 6 minutes.
for all that. I think that we should leave these names as they are, but we should use these as teachable moments, tools, if you will, to incorporate the rest of the history of these individuals that these places were named for. If indeed these people were slave owning men, chances are they were men. We need to reveal the rest of their history. Were in their enslavement of these people, did they go a little further? Can we find in their DNA somebody who looks like me? Can we find in their past their resistance to those who were at some point in their lives, if they became free, if these people were still alive at the time emancipation occurred in this state, were they impeding the ability for those African Americans to pursue their happiness? And if indeed that was the case, that needs to be revealed in the history of these people that these places are named for. No, I don't think the places should be renamed, but I think we need to use these as teaching tools to tell the rest of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because, exactly in the same way, if we were to say, stop talking about a Hasbrook because he owned slaves, are we then kind of ending the discussion of the fact that the founders of New Paltz owned slaves? We need to keep being able to discuss these people to talk about the whole picture.
That's right. That's like trying to take the N-word out of Huckleberry Finn. There is a case in South Carolina where a gentleman, a councilman in Greenwood, wanted to change a sign on the World War II monument because during World War II, the soldiers were segregated. And the soldiers, that sign is listed as such. They've got the black soldiers, they've got the white soldiers. This man wants to do away with that sign and put them all in alphabetical order. No. That's wrong. As if segregation didn't exist at that time. They're trying to whitewash this history, and that's just wrong, in my opinion.
Yeah. Do you have anything you want to add as well, Terry?
No, I agree with it. It needs to stay the same. Don't change the name. Just add the true history there. Just add the rest of the story. If you were a slave owner, tell it.
Yeah.
If you had a relationship with one of your slaves, tell it. The whole story needs to be told, not just a portion that they did such great work. Just put the rest of the story there. Tell the whole story. And when you do that and quit trying to whitewash history, we'll all be better for it. We'll all be better for it, because there's a lot of history that's still yet to be uncovered. And not just in New Paltz, all over the world. It needs to be uncovered, and the truth needs to be told. What the real history of the United States, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, really, there should be no omissions on either side of the topic.
Amen.
All right. So, Thank you again, both of you, so much for joining me. For those who are interested in this weekend's program, Joseph and Terry will be spending tomorrow night in 2 historic slave dwellings on Huguenot Street. Guests for the overnight have already been selected, but on Saturday evening at 5 p.m., we'll have a special catered reception on Huguenot Street, during which Joseph will share his thoughts on the experience, and that talk will begin at 6:30 p.m. You can register for that at huguenotstreet.org/McGill reception. That's huguenotstreet.org/MCGILL reception. And the following evening, on Sunday, there will be a lecture and reception here at SUNY New Paltz, and that event is free and open to the public at 6 p.m. at the College Terrace. We're wrapping up for tonight now, but listeners can tune in every Thursday at 7:30 p.m. for the rest of the semester at WFNP.org or 88.7 FM to hear more from Historic Huguenot Street. Visit huguenotstreet.org for information on all of our upcoming events. You can also follow us on social media and sign up for our email list to stay informed on what's happening on the street. Thank you for listening.
WFNP